So, today's discussion is going to focus on how Google as, there's going to be a couple other major players in the information and media arena that I think we have something to learn from. But Google's really going to be what I'm going to be focusing on. Google's always identified as one of those institutions that is a technology disruptor. What Google does is they go in and they change the game. They completely look at the rules and they ask that inevitable question, why? And can we do something else? Can we do something better? Well, as we look at Google, one of the things that I think we want to focus on is how can we use these advantages to capture students, increase revenue, and enhance alumni support. So, a little bit of history. As I was preparing for this, I said, well, let's take a look at, how has learning changed and how has technology changed. What I found is history, and George Washington Carver tells us a lot about where learning happens. Learning happens essentially where there's a need to know something. Now, if you look at this progression of what they were doing at Tuskegee in the 30s, late 20s, early 30s, we have the concept of taking learning outside of the academy. And initially it was done with horse and buggy, right? It's a horse-drawn cart. Eventually it progressed to a more modern truck, something that would have an engine, be driven on fuel, and ultimately we see this progression to a vehicle that we would somewhat recognize. Now, this early example of learning, taking learning out of the academy, has what I would identify from the arena I come from as being something that existed first in a mechanical platform. Now, early on in the information superhighway, a lot of people talked about destinations. You would go to AOL, or you would go to CompuServe, you would go to Yahoo. Industry leaders always considered these destinations to be portals, because you would go to this one particular location, a destination, a URL on the internet, and ultimately from there you would get everything that you needed. It was kind of single source distribution. Well, a portal is also a vehicle of information dissemination. I thought, well, that's really kind of interesting because the first mechanical platform to take learning out of the academy was in the form of a vehicle. So that's our mechanical platform. Well, in the span of about 20 years, we see this progression from the mechanical to the electrical platform. Now, in this picture, this is something I picked up a couple of weeks ago while I was doing some training classes up in New York City. I was in the CBS building on West 57th Street, where Katie Kirk works, and in their lobby they have this interesting photo. So I took a picture of it with my digital camera and said, I want to use that in my deck. This is a photo taken in the Grand Ballroom of the Biltmore Hotel in 1949. So 60 years ago, we were doing distance learning, or telelearning, telemedicine. Doctors reviewing a surgical operation from a remote location. They never disclosed where that location was. But we see this progression of taking learning, the shared knowledge, out of the academy from the mechanical to the electrical or electronic platform. Now, we see two drawbacks with the early models. The mechanical model is limited by physical boundaries. You're only talking about distances for those trucks and buggies of tens to hundreds of miles. When you get to an electronic broadcast, well, things open up quite a bit. Now you can talk about information being shared, learning happening over thousands of miles. If we consider any drawback in that approach, it's that it's linear, and it doesn't particularly scale well, and it's not bidirectional. So there are some inherent limits there. Well, ultimately, we progress to today. Digital platforms. So we see evidence in things like Twitter. It is initially thought of, usually dismissed, as being nothing but chatter. Nothing but chatter. Unless you're in the midst of a coup or a tsunami, addition, platforms like Facebook, YouTube, iTunes, and the iPod Touch, or iPhone, which essentially means now learning no longer has the boundaries that they had with some of the previous electronic and mechanical platforms. So what does this all mean? Well, it means ultimately the death of distance, right? So when we remove distance as a barrier to accessing knowledge, sharing information, then everything changes. Okay, so now we're going to get into the Google aspect. The URL at the top is google.stanford.edu. When Google first started, that's how you access them, because it was a research project that initiated as part of a PhD thesis by Larry Page and Sergey Brin at Stanford. I don't know how many of our institutions have technology sharing agreements as part of research initiatives, but one thing that should resonate with all of us is that when Google went public, that infamous IPO in 2004 that used a Dutch auction means of their public offering, they did not own the intellectual property to their algorithms. Stanford did. Google licensed them. So the day that Google went public, Stanford got $1 billion. So, a brief history of it, it's actually an interesting story. In 1998, they first entered into the search arena, and this is a defining moment for them. They had only started with $100,000 investment from another Stanford alumnus, and nobody thought that they should even consider getting into this arena. It was already dominated by Yahoo, AOL, Excite, Lycos, Microsoft, Netscape. So these two grad students, they're in their early 20s, thought that they would develop this algorithm, they would go to Yahoo, and they were going to sell it for $1 million. Well, after the meeting with Yahoo, Yahoo decided they're only going to offer them $200,000. So the grad students were looking at using that money and paying off their student loans, or just hanging in there and see what happens with this. 6 years later, they go public at a phenomenal $85 per share. Great story. So now, we come to today. It's no longer google.stanford.edu. They abandoned that actually in '98. And it's google.com. And last I checked, their closing price had gone from $85 from the initial IPO to $588 per share. They have a market capitalization of $187 billion. Revenue of just under $22 billion. 19,665 employees on record. Most people say that when you count student interns, it's about 20,000. Now, heads of state, captains of industry, competitors, all remark that it's very likely that Google has hired 20,000 of the smartest people on the planet.